power plants. The emissions from power plant also contain mercury. So the elemental mercury can fall in the water and it gets into the sediment and it goes up the food chain. There can also be industrial contamination. There's mercury in fluorescent lamps. There's mercury in a wide variety of consumer items that can leach from landfills and other type of facilities and contaminate groundwater and end up in a lake.
African Americans eat a lot of fish. That's just something that has been passed on. African Americans started off in the southern part of the U.S. and rural communities tend to fish a lot because you have a lot of ponds and creeks, and so those traditions are carried on even after migration. And then also the eating patterns and tastes and things like that, so fish is a big part of the diet. This is why the word has to get out to African Americans and Latinos and communities that really consume a lot of fish.
The Illinois Department of Public Health has a website that addresses contaminated fish in the state. It tells you which fish are contaminated in which bodies of water.
While Chicagoans can and should minimize their exposure to mercury by adjusting their diets and avoiding fish, power plants and waste incinerators have not to date lowered their emissions of mercury.
According to a study by Harvard School of Public Health, Chicago's 2 antiquated power plants can cause 40 premature deaths per year, 2,800 asthma attacks per year, and 500 emergency room visits per year.
Good evening. My name is Griselda Mata. This is my little daughter. She has special needs. She has developmental delays. And when I went to the doctor, he asked, am I exposed to mercury or lead or toxin? And I said no, but I think yes, because that chimney is on nonstop 24 hours, and there's statistics that in Hilton there's a high prevalence for special needs and autism, and this is affecting our lives. Thank you.
Now, there's something problematic about a society that says we should protect the unborn against abortion, and we should, but then that society ignores the fact that we pollute the air and the water with mercury in ways that are damaging already 1 in 6 of our children. There's something wrong with a society that says it's opposed to abortion, but then at the same time wants to triple allowable mercury emissions from power plants.
The struggle to limit mercury emissions in Illinois continues. In 2006, Governor Rod Blagojevich proposed changes for mercury legislation, and now a public hearing process has begun. Another heavy metal that severely endangers children's health is lead.
Lead poisoning itself is very ancient. It goes back 2,000 years. And for a very long time, we've known that if you have enough lead exposure, that you can have actual death from lead.
Well, the main effect of lead relates to damage to the nervous system, specifically damage to the brain.
It exerts a severe effect on neurological development, and this is particularly critical in the first 2 years of life. Right? So your brain will not develop normally, and you will not develop to full intelligence if you're exposed to lead in the first couple of years of life.
What we found is that even at lower and lower and lower levels that we used to think were safe, if you study a whole population, you'll find differences in those people with the higher lead levels than with the lower lead levels.
Over the past decades, the Center for Disease Control, CDC, has lowered the threshold of blood lead levels several times, from 40 micrograms per deciliter in 1971 to 10 micrograms per deciliter in 1991.
The average blood lead level in the United States is less than 3. It's gone down every time they measure it, but that's not true in urban areas and especially among young children.
Large cities still have lead problems like Chicago, but the levels here are coming down also.
According to data from the Illinois Department of Public Health, in 2003, over 6% of children tested in Chicago had elevated blood lead levels. However, the burden of lead poisoning is not evenly distributed across the city. In 10 predominantly minority neighborhoods on Chicago's south and west sides, between 10% to 18% of children had lead poisoning. In 11 additional minority neighborhoods on the south and west side, up to 10% of children had lead poisoning. This is in sharp contrast to some other areas of the city, where minorities are less concentrated. Fewer than 2% of the children living in these areas have high blood lead levels.
In the city of Chicago, the average lead level for African American children is twice the average for Latino children, and the average level for Latino children is twice that of white children.
The correlation with poverty is enormous. The correlation with race is enormous.
I'm not sure how intentional it was, but the results are that there is a racial disparity in terms of lead poisoning.
My 4-year-old is my great-grandbaby. He gets weak, and when they did a blood transfusion, it showed up in his body. And they came out here and checked. That's when I found out that I had lead.
In the city of Chicago, it's required that all children should be tested for lead. We have lead inspectors who come out to the home to test the home for lead. The typical sources of lead poisoning in Chicago are mostly related to household paint. It was paint that was produced here in the U.S. Generally before 1970. The main risk comes in older homes.
They have layers and layers of paint over the surfaces, and so when they start peeling, that's when you get down to the areas that had the leaded paint.
In terms of the height, this is a perfect balancing beam for a child that's beginning to walk. So it's right at their level, it's easy to bite on. So we're really concerned with areas like this. If you notice here on the actual windowsill, if you take a look, there's also a lot of dust. Even though they may not even touch anything here, this dust could be the actual culprit. We do have some minimal repairs, and we have the homeowners come down to a class at the health department so we can show them how to do it safely and correctly. Some methods are required to have a licensed lead contractor to use because we don't want the homeowner disturbing the paint any more than what it is and causing a bigger situation, thereby causing more contamination throughout the rest of the house. We also have a nursing staff that then comes out and does follow-up work with the parents, and they get into some more specific things that the parents can do as well.
Also have menus of nutrition for him to eat to kind of get it lower. Well, actually, eat more vegetables and fruit, and he drinks 1.5 gallons of milk a day.
If a child's anemic, they can absorb more lead. They can become iron deficient because of the poor quality of food.
I'm finding some lead in your house, so I can tell you where the good paint is and the bad paint is. Chicago's housing stock is very, very old, and the problems that we're finding here today are very common.
It's existing homes that are generally in poor neighborhoods that we see the most of the lead poisoning problems. And there's still some lead in dirt, soil, so that's still a possible exposure pathway as well.
In Chicago, you're going to find that the lead in the soils is incredibly high. It's due to the deterioration of paint. There's industrial sources of lead, and oftentimes there's a closer proximity to high traffic areas. Now the association there is the burning of leaded gasoline.
It used to be that leaded gasoline was the major form of gasoline, and it wasn't until the 1970s that people quite understood how devastating that was.
We burned lead, and then that lead went into the air and it was redeposited on the ground. So what you have is that the soils act like a sponge, that they just keep absorbing and accumulating lead, and this goes on for decades.
Gasoline, liquid power to run millions of automobiles everywhere. Yet, how many know what happens to the gas after it is poured into the gas tanks?
In gasoline, they chose lead purely because of the commercial reasons. When they added tetraethyl lead, it made engines much more fuel efficient. But you released lead into the environment, and it was known as a poison. The government knew too, and really, I think that the industrial lobby, the corporate lobby, was much greater than the children's lobby. If you go out in your yard, you're going to find that there can be very high levels of lead in the soils. It's highest usually in the drip line of the building. So it's the first couple of feet from the edge of the building out into the yard. The lead would tend to be deposited on the roof, and it would build up, and then when there was a rain, it would all come off. So what happens in yards is that little children exhibit hand-to-mouth activity. So you will inadvertently ingest a huge amount of lead in just the normal process of playing. The EPA has said that a lead level of 400 ppm is what's safe for children to play in. And I would say the only areas in a yard we found to be safe were the parkways. So to let your child play in the street is safer than it is to let them play in the backyard if you're looking at the levels of lead.
If you have been damaged early on from having eaten lead paint, then you're already operating at a deficit before you even walk in the door.
What's so tragic about environmental racism is that because so much pollution exposure, particularly heavy metals, are correlated with things like attention deficit disorder and neurological deficits, then people are dehumanized because they cannot reason, they cannot think as well as they might. They are literally being destroyed at the core of what they are as human beings.
My work in environmental justice began when my son developed food allergies, coupled with asthma. We'd go to the emergency room and they couldn't control the wheezing and he would be hospitalized. His food allergies and the asthma were interrelated. I didn't know what was wrong. He seemed like he was having an allergic reaction, but I'm not a doctor. And then I started to research allergies and food and things like that. So I self-educated. And as I started to research what quality meant, I ran into all kinds of terms that I had never heard of. Genetically modified food. I had no idea what that was. And at that time, my husband and I were vegetarians, and so we were eating a lot of soy products. I didn't realize that 80% of soy products were genetically modified. And so I was really pressed into what is organic food, where can I buy it, because my son needs it. And that's when it dawned on me that I couldn't buy organic food in my neighborhood. In fact, I couldn't grocery shop in my neighborhood. We did not have a chain grocery store in the West Garfield community. What is available in our area are corner stores is what folks have, and they primarily sell liquor and some staple goods. And I don't want to paint a negative picture of those corner stores, because those corner stores are ran by people who have families, and it's a viable business opportunity.
In my neighborhood, in East Garfield Park, when one goes to any local grocery store, by and large the meat will be old or should be discarded, and other products may have expired shelf lives. The grocers who don't live in the neighborhood feel quite comfortable in selling bad products to people who are virtually prisoners in their own neighborhoods. So this adds to a very bad environment when it comes to getting fresh foods to keep children and the entire family healthy.
We know that we need to look more at our diet and our nutrition in terms of health for our children. And so if I'm a pregnant young woman and I don't know anything about nutrition, and I'm eating a lot of processed foods and junk and sugar, how is that impacting my child?
The other thing that I realized was that organic food was way more expensive And that is how we ended up with growing the food ourselves. We just really felt that I didn't have to pay $5.99 a pound for lettuce during the growing season. I had a big backyard, and so that's how we started. What we also realized was that there's a tremendous legacy of food growing and the love of land in African American communities that oftentimes goes overlooked. So much of our history has involved a traumatic relationship with land. We were brung here as slaves to work the land, so we have a connection to the land that's not that foreign. African Americans would pay more for food if they understood the connection between food, diet, and health. If you sit down and talk about some of the chronic disease states that our communities face, such as diabetes, hypertension, strokes, heart disease, you begin to talk to people about their diet and what they've been eating and what they have access to. Then you see people having this awakening. I don't think that the information that's needed is available to communities of color, and that is the reason why we started the Institute for Community Resource Development. Our mission is to rebuild the local food system for people of color. Our main projects are urban agriculture. We convert vacant lots to urban farm sites and sell that food at farmers markets in urban communities. Our motto is that every community has the intellect to heal itself. So if there's something in your community that you want to change, you know what that change should be, and you can put that together and do it. We oftentimes think that, oh, this is something new, working on the local food system. This is not something that's new. In my research, I've realized that in the 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement, that food access was a big issue. Dr. King and some of the other groups started to work on bread companies that would use sawdust in the processing.
As Martin Luther King says, people don't give up power willingly. We must encourage people to do the right thing.
We as a church are called to speak out for the voiceless. We as church are called to bring hope to the hopeless. And if that person cannot speak for themselves, then we must speak for them.
We talk about wanting to protect life and defend life. But it seems so often that once life enters the world, we kind of abandon it.
What is the right to life? Who has the right to life? Who enjoys that? It is not so clear in our laws. Our government, our society gains with things like abortion or killing off the elderly, people dying because they're living in environments that are just simply unhealthy. Now, if you have a fundamental understanding of the right to life and health, you wouldn't be doing those things. It could be that those in power might not be concerned because the lack of the right to life is to their advantage.
Sociologically, Catholics tend to be one of the most educated and one of the most economically well-off groups in the United States. And many of the people in the pews are the very people who are the polluters. They're the CEOs who put minorities at risk, people in developing nations at risk. And I think they do so without realizing what they're doing. They think that if they promote economic development, everybody will be better off. They simply don't realize that economic growth is typically bought at the price of the health of minorities.
Racism is not about you not liking me. While personal prejudice is something that we work to eradicate, we also know that part of that comes from a conversion of heart. But racism is more than that. And it's the power of institutions and systems over the lives of people of color and over the poor.
Racism is a sin that blots out the image of God in the human community. The bishops had that right, and you know what? That is not a new Catholic doctrine. Thomas Aquinas, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, said in the Summa Theologia that all creatures mirror God. We humans especially mirror God because we have intellect and will. If we are supposed to be connected as humans because we bear the image of God in our ability to love, I don't see how loving people can stand by and do little while minorities among us are 7 to 10 times more likely to breathe dirty air or drink dirty water.
Catholic social teaching demands and directs us to engage in the environmental justice movement because it is a movement of protecting those least able to speak for themselves by giving them the power, the tools to act for themselves.
Make us free. Truth shall make us free someday.
For us as Catholics, the connection between the right to life and civil rights is a natural.
Truth shall make us free someday.
This movement requires the same kind of activism that the civil rights movement demanded of us. You're called to take action. And as Martin Luther King said, we should become, and I'll paraphrase, drum majors for environmental justice.
We shall overcome someday.
I'll tell you what a 94-year-old friend of mine says about praying. You know, if you want to get something done, you must first pray, but then you've got to get up off your knees and hustle. And so for us as African American Catholics, you know, we now have to get up off our knees and go out the church doors and begin to hustle in our communities about the threats of environmental injustice to our people.
Bye.